I don't know guys, right off the cuff, I'll admit that I had a hard time reviewing this one, or I should say I had some difficulty finding the fun while playing through it. To be upfront though, it could be that I am in a slump after going through 3 Command & Conquer reviews and maybe RTS just needs to go on cooldown for a bit, but I distinctly remember having this feeling before in 2008. Anyways, what is Red Alert 3? Well, it's the third of the acclaimed Red Alert games by Westwood, except this time it isn't Westwood. Coming out in 2008, Red Alert 3 is made by EA Los Angeles, who also made Command & Conquer Generals. In Red Alert 3, you either side with the Soviets, the Allied forces, or the Empire of the Rising Sun. Plot-wise, the Soviet Empire is about to fall after the events of the first 2 games, and the Soviets find a way to time travel back in time because of course they do. It's a Red Alert game. And when they do to Albert Einstein what Albert Einstein did to a certain mustached man in Red Alert, effectively altering the timeline. The new timeline is kinder to the Soviets and has the Allied forces on the ropes. Unfortunately, it means that Japan has risen to be a dominant empire as well and seeks to bring the world under its rule. You might notice that Yuri gets 0 mentions here and it's totally irrelevant to what's going on. The Red Alert series has always wiped the slate clean in terms of the carried plot, and that's fine. I think the opening premise of Red Alert 3 is actually really strong and holds a lot of promise, and hey, now there's 2 fun factions straight out of the gate. Now, I bought the special edition of Red Alert 3 which came with the soundtrack and a gold-plated steel tin. It would be an understatement to say that I was keen on the game when it first came out, but it has some problems, and I think it becomes immediately obvious when you listen to Hell March 3. In fact, you can use Hell March 3 as a parallel for the entire review. They added a horn section and more vocals, bringing a more theatrical feel to it that brings the whole track very much in line with the theme of the Soviet War March. You could say that on paper it should be an improvement, but very few people would say it's their favorite of the 3. I guess while it is good, it lacks the raw aggression of the first 2 versions, and from that point onwards you just get the feeling that something's not quite right with Hell March 3, and the same can be said for the entire game. Now, the obvious answer is, well, yeah, it's a different studio, and while some of the core talent might have carried over, a lot of the people involved are different people with different ideas. Now, I do want to commend EA Los Angeles here in that they definitely gave it a red hot go, and I think they did a lot of things right in trying to mimic the inspiration, and in some ways they even improved on the formula. There's a bit of stigma here. EA Los Angeles more than proved themselves with Command & Conquer Generals, but Command & Conquer Generals was more of a sidestep in the franchise, so the fans weren't as concerned with how it played because it didn't have a precedence to be compared to. Red Alert 3, however, was the first Red Alert game after Westwood was dissolved by Electronic Arts. People didn't like that. People still don't like how EA took Westwood to the back of the shed, and I don't think that EA realized or cared that Red Alert 3 needed to fit like a glove and be superb. Unfortunately, Red Alert 3 does not fit like a glove, and it's not superb. It is decent though, so let's talk about what it gets right and where it goes wrong. So Red Alert 3 is the first fully 3D Red Alert, and I'll just say that the water and electricity effects in this game are gorgeous. Like, there's so much detail in the water that I kind of lose my units sometimes, which is a bit of a negative, but credit where credit is due. It looks beautiful, and it's just as well because Red Alert 3 has a heavy emphasis on naval combat, since you can now build bases out in the ocean, but more on that later. Now, we start to run into problems once we realize that the engine for Red Alert 3 is locked at 30 frames per second, and it cannot be altered without changing the game speed. It's not the end of the world, but that's the first crack in the visuals, especially when considering shadows passing over terrain. I think the biggest problem though is that Red Alert 3 was made as a 3D game because 3D RTS was the norm, and no one stopped to ask if it should be. Look at the conscript from Red Alert 2. Now look at the conscript from Red Alert 3. Massive concessions are made in development to keep polygon counts low, because remember, Red Alert 3 doesn't have a stated population cap, and as a result the human figures look a bit like they're made out of Lego. It doesn't end there though. Look at the vehicles, they look like Tonka toys. And yeah, Red Alert 2 had a cartoony appeal to it, but there's a distinct difference between a cartoon aesthetic and a loss of detail. The overall effect is that it feels like you are pushing miniatures around in the real world instead of being part of a fantasy with a different aesthetic to reality. This extends to explosions too, and actually many current RTS games make this mistake as well. When vehicles and buildings blow up, the explosion effects are often underwhelming in comparison to the arbitrary polygons being spewed in every direction. For example, look at how this building crumbles. Does this look like a building that exploded, or does it look like a cardboard cutout that has been randomly cut up and thrown onto the screen? So yeah, in comparison, when handling explosions in 2D, the artist had to research or at least think about what would make sense. For example, in Tiberian Sun, it would usually be the wheels of a vehicle that would go flying from an explosion, and in some ways it's a keep it simple stupid situation where people want to see satisfying explosions with a couple key details to wow the viewer. I think if Red Alert 2 hadn't been so excellent in its presentation, Red Alert 3 could have gotten away with the current presentation, but it's really hard to ignore the comparison because of the precedents. We're going to see this a lot where it feels like less is more, but it's more a case of less is less, and perhaps there wasn't enough thought into the why behind the scenes. Okay, but what about the gameplay? Is Red Alert 3 fun? Yes, it is, but it's just not quite as good, is it? I'll emphasize that the Soviets maintain their might is right approach with all the zaniness you might expect from them. I mean, war bears. The Allies are still boring, but I will say that they are more fun now, and I'll explain why later. The Empire of the Rising Sun are cool too. Not as cool as Yuri though, which sucks because Yuri's Revenge was phenomenal and Red Alert 3 really needed the Empire of the Rising Sun to be an equal, if not an improvement. Anyways, the Empire of the Rising Sun play like an anime faction with samurai and mecha and advanced tech, but they have the most shallow story of the three, so it doesn't feel quite as at home as the other two factions. Well, one of the coolest things about Red Alert 3 is that every mission is intended to be played in a co-op capacity, and if you play it solo, you get a mostly competent AI companion that is actually acted out as a character. In fact, every companion or enemy you fight against is a character in the game, and they will contact you from time to time to either offer support or smack talk you. Honestly, why is this not the standard in RTS? It works really well here, and it would work even better now that game connections are a simpler process in 2023. I do wish that there was a bit more to the mechanic. For example, I wish that there was a relationship aspect or a rapport system, perhaps some RPG elements, but all in all, what is there really works, and it never really gets in the way if you're playing solo. Or I should say, it would work really well, but the servers aren't online. So you have to follow some instructions and connect to C&C online servers, and frankly, I just didn't feel like it, but it's there, and it's a good idea if you want to put in the extra work. I'll leave a link to the instructions in the description. So you're likely aware that the Red Alert series attempts to balance naval and ground combat. Red Alert 3 approaches this task by allowing you to build your base out on the ocean. There are a couple buildings that have to be on the land, but overall, expanding your base is also a simpler process than in previous games. The end result is that amphibious vehicles end up being very efficient and desired because you usually need to engage on sea and land, considering half your base might be on land and half of it might be in the sea. The other result is that a lot of the maps are very similar to each other, where you are on an island, your companion is on another island, and your opponent is on a mainland of sorts. There's nothing wrong with this format per se, but you find yourself thinking of missions that don't follow this format more fondly because it gets a little overplayed. Another knock-on effect is that resource management has been simplified to the point where you might wonder why it's there at all. In short, you no longer harvest ore and there are no high-value ore deposits. Instead, ore comes from a mine and you build the refinery right outside the mine, and your harvester rarely moves more than an inch or two on screen. As such, a lot of the decision-making is taken out of the hands of the player, and you can think of it moving more towards having a set income stream. It's not all simplification though. For example, almost every unit in the game has a secondary function. For example, the Bullfrog APC can launch infantry units out of a cannon. Tanya can rewind time like Tracer from Overwatch, or more like Tracer can rewind time like Tanya from Red Alert 3. And tsunami tanks can use their nanomachines to increase defenses and self-repair. The result is that there's less focus on the macro aspects, and you are a bit more rewarded for being switched on fun in micro engagements. Unit abilities weren't new to Red Alert, but where they were usually a niche application like the Desolator in previous installments, they are now a second-to-second decision you need to consider, especially since some of them may turn off the ability to fire weapons. There's also far more emphasis on air units in Red Alert 3 since every unit can effectively hover, allowing you to play with a variety of bombers and fighters. Also, probably an important aspect that has changed is you get commander abilities that you access as you play the level, and you spend points on them like a talent tree. Some of them are interesting, like the magnetic satellite, but yeah, I feel kind of neutral on this change, and if I had the choice, I think I would have removed it. I'd rather these were upgrades that you access through a battle lab or a unique building like the Chronosphere or Iron Curtain. I personally prefer it when games offer a diegetic representation of their abilities. So yeah, I'll be honest, it took a while to get into Red Alert 3. I didn't find the first couple of missions fun in any of the campaigns, and I believe it's a combination of the changes mentioned and the inescapable comparison to Red Alert 2. I mean, I barely used infantry in Red Alert 3 because they are useless unless they are launched through a bullfrog. And am I launching them with a bullfrog because I need to, or am I doing it because it looks funny? It's probably the latter, but most infantry can't swim, so you need to build transports, and they die very easily, even when you garrison buildings. So I think the low-tier gameplay is simply boring, because the fantasy isn't there in the same way, and how you build your base doesn't really matter either. I will say though that once you get your high-tech units and you get to play with all the toys, it's quite engaging, sometimes too engaging, but nonetheless the fun is there. I think most of the fun happens more on a micro level where you are interacting with your units. I suppose we should probably talk about how each faction feels to play. Anyone with a familiarity to RTS will know that you need to collect resources and then spend your resources to get combat units to then conquer more territory to get more resources. At least that's the basic premise. One thing that you will notice is that the Allies and Soviets have to build within the range of their construction yard or within their allies' territory. If they want to build somewhere else, they'll either have to make another construction yard or make an expansion unit. For the Soviets, it's the Sputnik, which is a unique vehicle, and for the Allies, it's the Prospector, which also doubles as their ore collector. Furthermore, Soviet buildings build as money is siphoned from your account, while Allies have to pay over a period of time and then instantly construct their buildings once finished. The Empire of the Rising Sun instead doesn't have territory limitations because all of their buildings are vehicles that build very quickly and then unpack over time once they are deployed. Starting with the Empire of the Rising Sun, most of their units are transformers of some sort, which makes them quite versatile. For example, the Striker VX is a mech that is anti-air, but it transforms into a helicopter and it shoots air-to-ground targets. A lot of the units function in this manner, where they are designed for a particular purpose, but then transform to cover the reverse of it. I know that I said that I don't enjoy infantry very much in Red Alert 3, but the Rocket Angel was a standout unit for me. I mean, it's very anime, and yeah, some of you are thinking that I'm saying that as a negative, but I like anime. 新陳代謝の活発な脳で羨ましいよ。 So deal with it. Aside from that though, they fly, they shoot ground and air targets, and their alternative fire outright disables enemy units. There are only 2 units in the game that can do this, and the other one cannot leave the ocean. Aside from their health pools, they are incredibly strong and help shore up one of the biggest holes within the Empire's forces. Simply put, there are no fighters or bombers. Now the Rocket Angel is good, and like I said, they have multiple anti-air options to make up for it, but I found that the Empire just loses most dogfights if it's air units. That said, none of the Empire's air units require rearming or landing points. The Allies, I would say, are more the owners of the airspace, having good fighters, light bombers, and heavy bombers that also double as transports for paratroopers. On top of this, the Allies sport the most annoying helicopter of all of RTS. The cryocopter doesn't kill anything, but they can either freeze a unit in place if left to fire long enough, or shrink your units, making them easier to kill. There's nothing more annoying than having your battleship shrunk down into obscurity. The Allies retain the IFV gimmick from Red Alert 2, where placing different infantry in them changes the turret. Their normal tank is meh, but the Mirage tank got a huge buff since it now doubles as the Mirage tank and the Prism tank, so these things really hurt. The secondary option disables all damage options and puts out a cloak field that hides units within the AoE. I'd say that the Allies' weak spot would be its navy. It's not that they are slouches by any means. I mean, destroyers and aircraft carriers are very powerful units, but I think that their amphibious units tend to be weak in comparison to the other factions, with the exception of the destroyer. The Soviets do not own the seas per se, but they are definitely monstrous on land, as they should be. The Apocalypse tank makes its glorious return. Sadly, it no longer has anti-air missiles, but it does now have a tractor beam that pulls a target to itself to be grinded into pieces, and such is the only acceptable end for any allied piece of machinery. Hammer tanks can leech life, making them very resistant, and of course the Tesla tank makes a return. The Soviets are no slouches in the air either. Kirov airships are still incredibly strong and difficult to kill. MiG fighters are decent at controlling the air, and twin blades are versatile transports with good air-to-ground capabilities, whether it be infantry or mechanized. I do think though that the Stingray is one of the best units in the game. This is a light craft with Tesla capabilities that are easy to mass, and they do incredibly high damage with their AoE ability on water, and then can hop onto the land and carry on. Of course, the Soviets also have V4 rocket launchers and dreadnoughts copy-pasted from Red Alert 2, and they are still good units, though I want to talk about artillery for a minute here. I'm not going to cover every aspect of gameplay here because this could go on for hours, but one thing I noticed is that Red Alert 3 pretty much flattened artillery across the factions. On the sea, the Allies have aircraft carriers, Soviets have dreadnoughts, and the Empire has the Shogun battleship. On land, the Allies have Athena cannons, Soviets have V4s, and the Empire has Wave Force artillery. This goes for defense as well. There isn't a lot of difference functionally between Tesla coils, Prism towers, which have now been renamed to Spectrum towers, and Wave Force towers. While I had fun playing with these units, it did feel like it took some identity away from the factions and made them play a bit samey. I didn't really need to think of another way to breach an enemy's defenses because after all, I just built a couple of the faction artillery units and away I went. I also found that many times I felt like there were too many ways to force your win condition. For example, when I was playing as the Allies, there was always a point where if I built 8 sentry bombers, I could just ignore air defenses and take out the target I wanted to. In the last mission of the Empire of the Rising Sun, I took out almost all of the main objectives with commander abilities before I even got my forces to their base. I don't know how I feel about this. On one hand, it's pretty fun being able to play the way I want. On the other hand, I felt like I didn't need to think carefully as long as I could hold out to the point of critical mass, and then the opponent seemed to just fall dead almost instantly. Now, bear in mind that I am talking about single player, and I'm sure the multiplayer experience would be different and there could be a lot of fun to be had, but I still worry about the abundance of commander abilities being annoying. Of course, we need to talk about commandos. Everyone gets one. Tanya is back and she has her time rewind belt, her dual handguns, and C4. She's as good as she ever was. Natasha Volkova is the Soviet commander and uses a sniper rifle and can call in airstrikes. Very similar to Boris from Red Alert 2, but has more range. Yuriko Omega is the champion of the Empire of the Rising Sun, and she's a schoolgirl with intense psychic powers that allow her to pretty much just throw tanks and enemy vehicles around and let out psychic screams that will kill infantry in an AoE. She's very good and very fun to use. I don't know, I think they're all good, but Yuriko is the new toy, so I had the most fun with her. Though I will say she didn't have an actor for any of the cutscenes. So let's talk about the cutscenes. I'm going to throw out some names here. Tim Curry, J.K. Simmons, Jenny McCarthy, Jonathan Price, Peter Stormare, and George Takei. This was not a small production. I can't even imagine what it cost to get all of these people on board. I mean, this isn't even the whole cast. There's more, and I guess the question is, was it worth it? And my conclusion is, sort of. This is just another example within the theme of having the A-team on paper but not being able to put it together in practice. I mean, George Takei's performance was great as the Emperor of the Rising Sun. That man can tell me bedtime stories any day of the week.
The Imperial War Machine has been unleashed. Do not struggle against what is inevitable.
But Tim Curry, on the other hand, playing as Premier Cherdenko, came across as phoned in.
Our situation is shockingly grim.
Compare Cherdenko from Red Alert 3 to Romanov from Red Alert 2, and the difference in passion for the project is obvious. Now, this isn't across the board. Some of the big names nailed their roles, while some didn't. And some of the relatively new faces here put Tim Curry to shame. I mean, I know we're talking about fake Russian accents, but listen to Commander Zana's cheesy Russian accent next to Tim Curry's.
Our situation is shockingly grim.
Comrade, we have come together once again. This place is pretty, but the battle we will wage here will be very beautiful.
She understood the assignment in more ways than one. Now it's here where I regret to inform you that the Soviets no longer have the most fun. Plot-wise, you're going to see the same sort of twists we saw in the first 2 games, but less good. By now, I'd have expected a different way of going about it. The Allied campaign was actually a really nice surprise, and you have to also play the Empire of the Rising Suns campaign to understand why things play out the way they do. But it was nice to see them take chances with the quote-unquote good guy story. The Empire of the Rising Sun story starts off with promise, but it's about as deep as the average American's understanding of geography. There isn't really much going on here, so if you're playing it, it's more so for the love of the faction's aesthetics. Interestingly, both the last mission of the Soviets and the ending of the Allied campaigns give appropriate nods to Red Alert 2, and that was nice. I liked it. I smirked a little. The last thing to note with the live action cutscenes is that they spent all of the money on Tim Curry and they couldn't afford to give top buttons to any of the women's clothing. And again, I think this is just EA Los Angeles looking at the Red Alert series at a glance and sort of not getting it. I mean, Jenny McCarthy was a Playboy model and most of the women in the game are dressed like pinup models. I mean, let's get this out of the way. I still think that Carrie Wurr was the best look for Tanya, but Jenny McCarthy did do a better job with character consistency. Anyways, even in Red Alert 2, Eva and Sophia are not presented in this way. And yes, they use them as carrots for an end-of-game tease, but if you really think about it, it was Carrie Wurr in fairly normal evening wear, and Alexandra Kaniak as Sophia isn't shown off at all in the same manner. So I'm not sure where the leap came from, but EA decided that there needed to be a girl that invites you over for a nightcap in every single campaign, and I'm going to tell it to you straight as a man of culture. Either commit to the degeneracy and give in to your darkest cravings, or keep it classy and tasteful and very light with the suggestions with deeper emotional connections. Red Alert 3 commits the sin of pussyfooting around like it's about something, but it comes off amateurish and drags down the entire production for it. Let's quickly talk about the music. Yes, Frank Lepacki was still a composer, but they added a bunch of other composers as well. All very talented people, I'm sure. But, like I said with Hell March 3, something isn't right here. And my theory is that this was a collaborative effort more so than one person directing everything, because the mixture of themes shows. Don't get me wrong, some of the tracks are awesome, but it's just not Red Alert. It simply lacks the aggression and zaniness. I mean, there are no random quotes about time travel halfway through the track. If we were talking about generals, this would have been a good soundtrack, but it's like they didn't quite understand the assignment. There is also an alternative version of Hellmarch in the game credited to First to Last. So that was Skrillex's Screamo band before he was Skrillex, which is cool and all, but I have 2 major problems with it. Now don't get me wrong, it has its moments where it slaps, but I'm a bass guitarist and I can respect using a pick, but the bass line for Hellmarch is too pure and beautiful for the clicking of a pick. I know this is very petty, but I hated that the guy didn't use his fingers. At least for the intro. The other thing I hate about it is the drummer decided to throw in a long sequence of just straight double kick, and it sounds out of time. It didn't add to the song at all. The breakdown is cool though, I like that. Anyways, this isn't a track review. The point is, I think the band needed more direction for it to be a good Hellmarch track. So anyways, here we are. Time is running out. Is Red Alert 3 a good game in 2023? I mean, yes? It's certainly above average, but it also doesn't deserve to sit alongside games like Red Alert 2, especially when you add in Yuri's Revenge. What's remarkable to me was how they had all of the ingredients, all of the talent, and all of the money, but try as they may, they could not put it together where it really mattered. Now, don't misunderstand, if you see the gameplay and it looks good, absolutely give it a go. My main critique stems from the comparison to Red Alert 2, and those are tough boots to fill, but at the end of the day, that was Red Alert 3's job. Gun to my head and it's a photon rocket array, I give Red Alert 3 a 6 out of 10.